Welcome to the second presentation on Dr. Zhivago. The first one I did a few weeks ago, comparing Dr. Zhivago to Sound of Music, generally to the favor of Dr. Zhivago with its much more layered and complex characterization, plot, story, and the more Walt Disney end to Sound of Music. Today, this will be part 2 of the series. I'm going to move from the film Dr. Zhivago to the novel Dr. Zhivago. And much that is in the novel is not in the movie, and the movie adds considerable elements that are not in the book itself. And so I want to take the next step into looking at the novel itself, which was far more complex and demanding in terms of a read, but there's a fullness to the novel which obviously is not in the movie itself. I'll then move in part 3. I'll be looking at the poems at the end of Dr. Zhivago. Most people just see the movie and that's it. Some move on to the novel itself, and then others spend time lingering on the poems at the end, of which Yuri Zhivago, of course, wrote as a part of his journey. He was part doctor, part poet, and he was torn between two sides in his temperament. One very scientific, precise, exact, as a doctor has to be, the other intuition, the poet, the one who thinks from the heart and the soul. So Yuri Zhivago had these two elements in him. So that will be part 3, and then we'll move on later to Thomas Merton, his longer article on Dr. Zhivago, what was called the Pasternak Affair of 1958, and then finish of the relevance for Dr. Zhivago for today. So fast forwarding, so shuttling back and forth between past and present, and why this is a great epic novel with perennial themes. So part 2, Dr. Zhivago, the novel. There are 3 large backdrops to the novel itself. One is the almost lyrical quality by which Boris Pasternak describes the seasons of nature. So nature becomes almost its own sacrament, a natural sacrament in Dr. Zhivago. So you have the spring. It's the time of resurrection. Plants come back. The soil is warming. The seeds break through their skins. Rebirth is in the air. Then there's summer, which is the fruit-bearing season in the natural world, and we'll see how that plays out in people's lives. Not only nature itself resurrects, but there's the seasons when people come into their own in the summer season. And then there's the autumn season of a person's journey, just as the autumn season of nature, where leaves turn brown, rust, they fall from the tree, and then winter are taken into hibernation. And so what Boris Pasternak is doing, he's looking at, there's an antiphonal nature of nature itself in that sense, speaking to and fro, back and forth. And as people live through these seasons in nature, they echo the human journey itself. The second backdrop in Dr. Zhivago is the Russian Orthodox Church itself, in all of its fullness and pied glory. So the natural seasons are embodied and reach a supernatural form in the liturgy, the divine liturgy of the Russian Orthodox Church. So you have Easter, and what does that mean? And the resurrection of Christ, but first of all, the dying, 3 days in the tomb, then up from the grave he arose, and a new life begins, and the whole liturgy that's reflected in that. Then you have the life of Christ, and what that means in a very difficult and painful process is the many challenges that Christ faced with the disciples, the opposition he faced from the Pharisees and the scribes. And then you hit the autumn season when in fact these many tensions are mounting, the opposition is growing more intense, and then you get the crucifixion, and then finally from that, the resurrection. And so what Boris Pasternak is doing as a backdrop is both nature as a choir that antiphonally echoes one another, and then how the divine liturgy within the grand Russian Orthodox Church mirrors that, but lifts it to a much, much higher level itself in terms of the soul, the spirit, and the nature of the faith journey itself. The third background then, so those are the 2 constants in the particular novel, nature and the Russian Orthodox Church, but it's also set in the midst of the Russian Revolution itself. And so the novel opens pre-revolution, where are these tales of 2 cities, wealthy aristocrats fawning, indulging themselves, and you have poor working class people hardly able to pay rent, put food on the table, and then the implications of that. And so by 1917, the revolution occurs, and of course much of the novel takes place within the tragedy and the horrendous nature of that revolution itself, recognizing as a season, it will pass. All things pass. But in the passing, like when a dark cloud passes or a nasty storm comes through, there is tragedy that comes. But knowing, just as in the liturgical cycle of the church, the liturgical cycle of nature, all things come, all things go. What lasts in the coming and the going of the seasons, of the liturgy, and then historic events, which are a part of we all live with, as Martin Heidegger says, we all live in a state of thrownness. We are thrown into a body, a time in history, a language, a religious background, a political context. And what seems so intense at one point will pass. It will pass itself. And so these three backdrops to Zhivago: nature, the message of nature, the message of how the Russian Orthodox Church reflects, embodies, and fills out the message in the sermon of nature, and then the horrendous tragedy of the Russian Revolution and what that meant for many people. And this is where Dr. Zhivago and the many actors have to find their way. It's important to see Dr. Zhivago as a Shakespearean drama in many acts. Boris Pasternak was probably one of the greatest Russian translators of Shakespeare, and so he very much is acutely aware that this is a drama in novel form rather than various acts and scenes within acts, even though the novel itself, you can unpack it almost in a dramatic form. It's a tragicomedy or comedic tragedy. It's life itself in all of its fullness, some of its pain, its agony, some of its great aspirations and hopes. It's the blend of all of these elements. Now, there are seven major actors in Dr. Zhivago, and I want to briefly touch on them, and they play significant roles on the stage of this particular drama. One is Komarovsky. He is what we would see as, one sense, the right wing of Dr. Zhivago. He's a calculating, wheeling, dealing sort of person. He knows how to use the aristocrats, the entrepreneurial class, to his advantage. When the communists come to power and the partisans and the Reds, he knows how to stick handle through all of them to get what he wants. He's Yuri Zhivago's father's lawyer. In many ways, he plays a crucial role in Yuri Zhivago's father's suicide. He uses Yuri Zhivago's father to make wealth off him. He becomes then, in a sense, the person with Laura, his mother. He enters into a relationship with her. When that doesn't work out, he then takes advantage of the impressionable, youthful Laura. He then moves on through his journey, through much of the novel, to take advantage of people, but he knows how to constantly rise or like a cat that falls off the shelf. He'll constantly bounce back on his knees. So, but for Boris Pasternak, he embodies the person that's amoral, immoral, nothing is right or wrong, provided it gives me the wealth, the relationships, what I want of life. The other side would be Yuri Zhivago's half-brother, Yevgraf Zhivago. He almost is a godlike figure in the novel, a fascinating figure. He rises very quickly in the Communist Party, but he's not a party hack. He's not an ideologue. He's a person that knows how to live within a party, its ideology, but he constantly makes moves in Dr. Zhivago to protect his brother. Anytime Yuri Zhivago would be vulnerable to different ideological tendencies in the Communist Party, Yevgraf Zhivago will intervene on the behalf of Yuri Zhivago. So he's a person who knows how to live within a party that can be destructive, but he knows how in grace to navigate through that party and also to assist his brother. He almost becomes a Holy Spirit-like figure, Yevgraf Zhivago, in the novel. So he lives in the world of imperfection, of immorality, but he knows how to be moral within that. He's cynical of the Communist Party, but he's very high up in the Communist Party, and as a result of that, he's given a position of privilege, but he knows how to use that privilege to assist other people who are not as goose step, as it were, to the party. So if you've got Komarovsky at one extreme, then Yuri Zhivago's brother, Yevgraf, who fexers much larger in the movie Dr. Zhivago than he does in the book itself. He constantly hovers in the novel always there when Yuri Zhivago needs him, but then disappearing often for months at a time, only to reappear again in the moments of need, of dread, of tragedy, to redeem Yuri so that he is not killed or disappeared. So those would be in one sense two key figures in the novel. Komarovsky, the amoral, wheedling, calculating person who uses others, and Yevgraf, who very much is almost a Holy Spirit-like figure in the book. The next would be Tanya. Zhivago, Dr. Zhivago, when he was young, his mother died quite young, and the movie opens up, as does the book to some degree, with the burying of his mother. And the Gromyko family take him in, and Zhivago grows up with Tanya. In one sense, they become almost like brother and sister through much of their growing up, and it's just expected they're going to be married. They both grow up in a fairly wealthy, prosperous, well-educated family, and it's just almost a matter of course that of course you're going to be married. You've lived with the family for many years, and so Tanya becomes a key figure of faithfulness, a key figure of loyalty, a key figure who stays with Zhivago in the early years of his education, of the revolution, when they have to flee and then come back to Moscow, where their house is now taken over by a bunch of partisans. She's faithful. She keeps the fire going. She's there for Zhivago in an ongoing, in very turbulent times. When Zhivago is not about, he's not around, she raises the first child. They have then a second child when in Varakino, which of course Zhivago never sees again. And Tanya then with her father finally has to flee because as aristocrats, with the communists taking over their house and much of the culture in Moscow, St. Petersburg and others. And again, it's Yevgraf Zhivago who spirits them out of Moscow and gets them to Paris. And Paris was a place of a lot of Russian refugees who fled, and a large Russian Orthodox family settled in Paris, from which we get St. Vladimir's in North America and significant elements of the Russian Orthodox Church. So there's Tanya Zhivago, and sometimes she's ignored in the movie for the sake of the elevation of Lara or Larissa. But Tanya is a key factor of which Pasternak is making clear there's a level of faithfulness to someone through the difficult, the painful, the conflict times, not only in marriage, but in a very intense political situation where you lose your home, you watch your friends being killed, you watch many fleeing for their lives. But Tanya is the one who holds that family together. And so she's a very important figure that, as I said, often is ignored because of the romance of Laura and Zhivago. But Pasternak knows that Laura has to be held on front stage here because of her quality of character. And although Zhivago never sees her again after his near the end of the movie, and she's in Paris with the family, the letters sent from Tanya to Zhivago when he returns to Moscow at the end are very tender and touching. And when she becomes aware of his relationship with Lara or Arissa, and actually they meet in Uriatin, there's the level of interaction between Lara and Tanya is something that is admirable. It's something that warms the heart. It's something that cuts right deep into the flesh of the soul in that sense. And so Tanya needs to be given a much greater voice and space when analyzing Dr. Zhivago itself. Then there's the person that Laura first married, who's a fascinating study of a character. As a young boy, he was called Pasha, energetic, fun-loving, puckish, playful. But as the revolution heats up, he increasingly becomes aware that he can no more sit in the sidelines. He has to take a side. He and Lara get married. They're both fairly well educated. They find a place to teach a school in the Urals, but he's restless, very, very restless. He doesn't feel he can stay in this place given the large epic things that are happening in Russia at the time. So he gets very much involved in the military. He ascends very quickly, and he becomes a very intense ideologue. Their idea is worth living for, and you must sacrifice everything, including your wife and other people, to achieve the ends. So there's a transformation from Pasha to Strelnikov, in which he buries his human side. He buries the relational side, because the ideal is everything. And if you're not with me, if you're not in the path here in the ideal, you go. Including marriage, and then of course he becomes known as one of the most violent revolutionaries, Strelnikov. But he realizes also that in submerging the personal, the relational, the friendship, the marriage, he's also dehumanizing himself. And as the novel progresses, and of course as the revolutionary changes, Strelnikov, just as others became expendable for him, he now becomes expendable before the party. And he begins to try and find his way back to Laura, because he realizes what he has done has in fact dehumanized him as a human being. The memories he now has are highly lamentable, and he wants to return home to Laura. And there's a very touching scene as he's being hunted down near the end by the partisan group, very violent, that Zhivago himself is at Varakino, and Strelnikov finds his way to Zhivago, and they have a very touching conversation about Strelnikov trying to find his way back home to who he is as a human being, given what he has been and done. And of course, both the relationships with Laura make for a very illuminating conversation. Again, a very tender conversation, just as there was between Tanya and Laura. And some of those passages are heartrending in many ways, in terms of the tenderness on all sides, as they realize the tragedy and the sadness and the brokenness of it all. And so there's then the Strelnikov, or Pasha, which is important in this also. The other, of course, relationship that is not mentioned in Dr. Zhivago, the film itself, is when Zhivago returns to Moscow. His brother Yevgraf gets him a position, and he enters into a relationship with another woman. So it's the third woman. He has 2 children from this particular woman. He's aging. His heart is very weak, Dr. Zhivago, near the end. And he gets a little cranky near the end, and he's difficult to live with. And this third woman, of which he has 2 children, almost becomes a babysitter to him near the end. And as I said, in the movie, she doesn't appear at all. It just ends essentially with Zhivago in Moscow. He's on the tram, and Laura is walking by, and he tries to get out. And of course, he reaches out to her, but he has the heart attack on the street as she just keeps going. Obviously, one of the main actresses is Laura herself. Laura is often seen by many as a wisdom figure, a figure very much in touch with the earth and the soil, a person who suffers deeply, initially being taken advantage of by Komarovsky, who essentially rapes her as a child in her late teens. He has taken advantage of her mother, who's a seamstress. Her mother's health is not the best. So he ends up taking advantage of the young Laura. So her life begins with suffering, difficulty, and the big thing for Laura is, how do we make sense of failed expectations, tragedy, suffering? How do we find life, meaningful life through that? Is there any hope on the far side of tragedy? And the story of Laura is one of constantly trying to find her way forward. After these painful experiences, she then marries Pasha, who becomes Strelnikov, and the marriage seems to begin well, but then he leaves her. So a second relationship falls apart, and she becomes a nurse, and this is where she meets Zhivago, the first meeting of them. So she's a healer in that sense, as she tries to hold a marriage together with the child from Pasha Strelnikov. That doesn't work out. And so she has this third relationship with Zhivago, and of course it's shot through with very much almost the impossibility of it, given who she was married to, Strelnikov. So the Reds and the partisans were always watching Laura when she was in Yuriatin, because as soon as Strelnikov went down, she was going. because of her association with one of the most violent terrorists who was seen in the revolution at the time. So she lived a very fragile, a brittle shell life. In her short relationship sporadically with Zhivago become a key element, obviously, in the novel itself. But there's more to the novel than Laura. There's Tanya, and then of course there's Zhivago's third relationship. The novel is about Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago, as I mentioned earlier, he grows up in a context in which his father, by Komarovsky, had been taken advantage of. His father committed suicide because Komarovsky had wheeled and dealed with his account to make him appear broke. And so the young Zhivago grows up with Tanya, the Gromyko family. He seems to be on the edge of a fairly prosperous medical life. He's being trained as a doctor, a specialist. He's very gifted as a scientist in terms of the body, the anatomy, eyes. Interesting, eyes are very important for Zhivago, the one who sees in that sense. He holds together, I mentioned earlier, the scientist, the doctor, but also the poet who feels what's happening. Very important, as I'll get into in part 3. The first poem in the Zhivago sequence of poems is Hamlet. When I finished my BA, my graduating paper was on Hamlet. It was in the area of philosophy and literature. And Hamlet is always a divided figure. He sees too deeply to know what to do. He often gets paralyzed by his reflections, and he knows what he should do, but then there's other options. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? And you'll see time and time again, Zhivago is torn between two good things he must do. For example, with Tanya and Laura, he knows his relationship with Laura is not right, so he knows he has to break it off. He begins to head back to be with Tanya again, and that's when the guards steal him away. So his very plans are shredded, are torn apart by external circumstances which intervene in his life. And you'll see again and again that when Zhivago has to make a decision, he gets paralyzed, he doesn't know how to make the decision, and much of his life is like a Hamlet figure, torn to and fro by, well, I could do this, I could do this, I could go there, I could go there. Who should I work for? Should I be a doctor? Should I be a poet? What should I be? And so it's this very complex personality, like Shakespeare's Hamlet, which leads in one sense to the tragedy of Dr. Zhivago. It's not a happy ending movie. There are always constant tender moments of hope, breakthrough, when the Russian blue sky will appear, the sun will shine, but then literally moments later the dark clouds come in. And then how do you navigate when the dark clouds of life are very, very much a part of the journey? Near the end of the novel itself, Pasternak, one of the most poignant scenes or pungent scenes is when Komarovsky claims he's going to rescue Laura and her daughter Katya and get them away, because with Strelnikov now dead, her life is very, very much limited in terms of life expectancy. And Zhivago says he's going to go with them, and then there's this very long, touching scene in the novel, which is moved through quite quickly in the film, where he doesn't join them, and Komarovsky heads off with Laura and Katya, takes them up into the north, because Komarovsky is given a minister of justice position in Siberia. And of course, we don't hear much more of Laura after that, but in the book, when she comes to Zhivago's funeral, she just bends over the dead body, and she just ponders, and she breaks forth in literally hours of tears over what happened, because she ended up going to Siberia under Komarovsky and what she had to live through. And why didn't Zhivago join her on that? He said he was going to come. He didn't come to the train, and what happened? And of course, she had a child too, Tanya, which comes at the end of the novel, which the movie touches on in a little more detail than the book does. So Dr. Zhivago is probably, the film itself was one of the great films of the 20th century, but the novel itself, Dr. Zhivago, is probably one of the most superb epic novels written in the 20th century, and probably for all time, in terms of the depth of characters, the complex nature of characters, the plot, the nature of fragile hope in the midst of very difficult situations, in this case the Russian Revolution, where Zhivago is pushed pillar to post with these partisans, these groups who are launching attacks on the whites, on the aristocrats, always wanting to escape, and he tries to escape a few times. They catch him again, and then finally getting away. But what Pasternak is exploring, how do you hold relationships, community, family together in the middle of revolution when people are being pulled apart? You don't know if they're ever going to see them again. How do people navigate through such ambiguous, unpredictable situations? And so Pasternak does not flinch from asking very difficult questions. I mean, we mostly in the West live in a fairly benign context in comparison to the Russian Revolution. Very hard to understand, where your family's ripped apart, military people come in, they take your house, they fragment relationships. You don't know if you're going to see your children ever again, and if so, under what conditions. And so what Pasternak is doing, it's basically summing up, in many ways, the lives of many people who don't live in affluent, benign contexts, and then how do they navigate through this? And so I'll end with this at this point now. So just the background: nature as a liturgical cycle, the Russian Orthodox Church antiphonally at a higher level, singing forth what that means, but the backdrop of these great themes in life which continually move. You have the historic moment of the Revolution, which passes as a season, either in nature or in the Russian Orthodox liturgy. And then you have these actors and actresses on the stage of the Shakespearean drama, which is part comedy, part tragedy, but probably more tragedy than comedy anyways. Now, the thing that does last, Zhivago, of course, dies. What continues? Well, there's his daughter with Lara. She continues to live. And then, of course, what continues to live is the poetry of Zhivago. So he still lives, though dead, yet alive. And then, of course, what continues to live is nature, her cycles, the Russian Orthodox liturgy with its beauty itself, and then the revolution itself, like a season in history or a season in nature, it passes on, and these great themes of life continue.